Good afternoon. My name is Holly Dinnany. I am with Family Partners of Morris and Sussex County, and it is my privilege to welcome you to our weekly Lunch and Learn program, where we invite an expert in to talk to us about an important topic that supports those of us who care for children with challenges, be it one you birthed and you love, be it one that lives in your home, or be it one that you work with through your school or through your system. So we welcome you today. We remind you that our program is called Lunch and Learn. And it's okay if you're sitting at your desk and enjoying your lunch. We're okay with you keeping your camera off. We love to see smiling faces when we can, so feel free to do that as well. But a few housekeeping items, I would just invite you to use the chat function if you have a question on today's presentation or a comment that you would like to make. Our speaker will be sharing her screen, so Krista and I will be watching the chat function, and we'll be sure that your questions are asked. This is your Lunch and Learn. If you have a burning question, if you have an issue, if you have a challenge, please be sure and share it so that we can make sure that our speaker addresses that. Our program runs 60 minutes. We are recording today's event, so we will be sharing it with you following this presentation. And our topic today is one I think that touches on many of us can relate to, parenting a child experiencing or recovering from trauma. And we are very lucky to have with us today Tierney Bellies, who is with the Center for Education and Counseling, or Evaluation, I'm sorry, the Center for Evaluation and Counseling that has offices in Sparta, in Parsippany, and in Madison. And she is a licensed associate counselor, and she provides mental health counseling to families of all ages, or to individuals of all ages. And she's trained in something called trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, which I think you will learn is very important given today's topic. There's a lot to understand about trauma, a lot that we don't automatically know. So I am really honored to have Tierney with us today to talk about what's happening with a child experiencing trauma, and also what we should consider in dealing with a child with trauma. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Tierney Bellies. Take it away, Tierney.
Thank you, Holly. Hi, everyone. As Holly said, my name is Tierney. I'm a therapist. I'm from the Center for Evaluation and Counseling in Sparta, and I have the opportunity to work with kids and adolescents and people of all ages that have been affected by trauma in some way. So I'm really excited to be here with everyone today, and I'm going to share my screen and open up this PowerPoint. Just give me 1 minute. Okay. Okay, so everyone should be able to see my screen by now. Okay, so we have a lot of information to go over today. But as Holly mentioned, the presentation is going to be on parenting a child experiencing or recovering from trauma. So today we're going to be discussing a few topics, and I think they all build upon each other. So we're first going to begin by talking about trauma and what is trauma. And then I'm going to share with you how trauma can impact the brain and the development of children, and also impact their behavior. We're going to talk about resilience and how caregivers can foster that with their children. And we're going to also be talking about parenting trauma, especially when there's problematic behaviors. So we're going to be going over some skills and discipline strategies for that. And then we're going to be ending with some self-care for caregivers, because that is truly very important. And so let's just jump on in, because it's a lot of information, but I hope everyone finds it interesting. And if anyone has a question, just to drop it in the chat, and I'll be staying afterwards to spend time with whoever wants to talk more or has questions or anything like that. So let's just get started. Okay, so trauma. What is trauma? So trauma is defined as a response resulting from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful. Trauma can be life-threatening, and it can also have lasting effects on the individual's functioning, mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So essentially, when we think of trauma, we want to think of anything that basically overwhelms a person's ability to cope. So that's what we think about, when we think about trauma, when a person becomes overwhelmed. So on the screen right now, I have several types of trauma. These traumas we kind of refer to as big T traumas. So they're what you think of when you hear or you see or you experience abuse or neglect. So that includes a child maltreatment, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, things like that. It can also include accidents like motor vehicle accidents or even a traumatizing medical procedure. Trauma can include violence. So we include school violence, community violence, and domestic violence. That's a form of trauma. And then we have natural disasters, of course, that can result in trauma, and also acts of terrorism or war. That's considered trauma as well. So, but when we think about trauma, it's also important to know that trauma is basically the result of prolonged stress. And that can be due to situations such as caregiving, people that are responsible for caregiving for others. That can be a source of trauma. Living in poverty, unsafe living conditions, historical racism or environmental stressors, or even living throughout a pandemic like we've all experienced, that constant worry every day, worrying about something, that's a form of trauma. So these are our big T traumas. And these are our little t traumas. Now, the difference between big T and little t trauma is big T traumas usually are a threat to a person's life or a fear of bodily harm. But when we think about little t traumas, we want to think of more subtle trauma. Now, these are dangerous and these can be impactful because these type of little t traumas, that after time, they can debilitate an individual's psychological and emotional functioning by overwhelming their ability to cope. So little t trauma, what does that include? That includes interpersonal conflict. If you find yourself engaged in routine conflict or conflict over time with anyone in your social circle, that can be a source of little t trauma. Divorce, infidelity, legal conflict, financial instability, even phases of life changes, such as getting married or having a baby. All of these events can be sources of chronic stress, which we're going to get into, and that can impact the brain in the form of trauma. Going through an illness or injury, bullying, harassment, prolonged grief, unresolved grief, that can be a form of little t trauma as well. And then we have emotional abuse. A lot of times when we think of abuse, we think of physical abuse or domestic violence, psychological abuse, but emotional abuse is also considered a form of trauma. So how is trauma categorized? So an acute form of trauma would be a single or stressful event. So that could be when perhaps a person is a victim of a crime, or if someone is engaged in like a motor vehicle accident, that's considered an acute form of trauma. And then we have chronic trauma. So chronic trauma is when we think of things like domestic abuse, domestic violence, or even childhood sexual abuse. That is repeated and prolonged exposure to highly stressful events. So this could include multiple incidents of acute trauma that just happen over a period of time, or trauma that's prolonged and that has happened over and over again. And then the last form is complex trauma. Now, this is usually to describe the type of trauma that children and adolescents go through. And it usually happens over a period of time, and it could include abuse or neglect, and it can really impact the child's development. It can impact their sense of self, the way they form attachments with other people, their ability to self-regulate, and might result in psychological symptoms. So we're going to talk more about that as well. So this is a quote by Bessel van der Kolk, and he was a researcher, a psychiatrist, a really brilliant one who did extensive research over decades on trauma. So what Bessel van der Kolk says is that trauma results in a fundamental reorganization of the way the mind and the brain manage perceptions. It changes not only how we think and what we think about, but also our very capacity to think. So we're going to get into now how trauma affects the brain. This is very important because when we are examining a child's behavior, we want to look at it through a trauma-focused window. So it helps to understand what's happening in their brain and how that could be affecting their behavior. Okay, so trauma in the brain. This is the body's stress response. So in this picture, you can see a picture of the brain, and the blue part of the brain is the prefrontal cortex. Now, the prefrontal cortex is responsible for a lot of executive behavior. So we're talking about logic, we're talking about reasoning, we're talking about ability to concentrate. These are all very important functions of the prefrontal cortex. So at the bottom towards the brainstem, we have the amygdala and the hippocampus. That is part of the limbic system. So what happens when the brain perceives a threat to the body? This is done by sensing. So we either see something, we hear something, smell something that our body perceives as a threat. Immediately, the amygdala will become activated and the flight or fight response will be set in motion. When that happens, a series of hormones is released: adrenaline, norepinephrine, glucose, and cortisol. So cortisol is interesting because cortisol actually prevents you from feeling pain. And so it's very useful in emergency situations because the combination of these hormones helps you to act quickly, which is necessary if you're in a type of an emergency situation where you need to act and not think. So the medial prefrontal cortex responds by assessing the threat and executing behavior. The hippocampus provides context for memory. However, people that have experienced trauma, this whole function gets disrupted. And there is kind of a disruption between all these processes. So when the senses perceive as trauma, the brain immediately acts as if the trauma is happening. You're going to experience certain changes in your body, such as increased heart rate, blood pressure, and rate of breathing. All of these changes have a purpose because they are going to allow you to act quickly in case of an emergency situation. Now, this happens before the prefrontal cortex is able to really assess the threat, because there are sometimes, if you're in an emergency situation, you might need to act before you really think about it. So the problem is that this emotional brain, this limbic system, it does react faster than the prefrontal cortex by several seconds. And so people that have experienced trauma, what happens is that you basically establish faulty alarm systems, which increases the risk of the brain misinterpreting a stimulus and throwing that person into the fight, flight, or freeze response. So the issue with this is that release of cortisol, because cortisol is the stress hormone, and that can lead to a variety of long-term health issues. So these are the symptoms of trauma. Some of these might seem familiar to you. A person or a child experiencing trauma may only experience some of these symptoms. They may experience all of these symptoms. It really depends on the individual. So we have feelings of irritability, hyperarousal, which is key because that's kind of like that quick activation of the fight or the flight response. That's a problem for people that have experienced trauma because they may be very easily triggered by trauma reminders. They may experience lack of positive emotions, feelings of guilt or shame, have problems with memory or concentration, because remember how the prefrontal cortex is operating in the brain. Trauma can impact the way the whole system functions. People may have dreams, flashbacks. They may have avoidance, negative mood, negative thought, symptoms of anxiety, feelings of detachment, loss of interest, feelings of horror, fear, and sleep disturbances, or panic attacks. So these are all symptoms of trauma. So now we're going to get into there are 3 types of stress. And this is important and I think interesting to understand because the amount of stress and the type of stress a child experiences, that is what impacts their development. So there are 3 types of stress. The stress, positive stress, that's also called eustress. So that's the blue bubble that you see. Positive stress is not bad. Positive stress is, it's a moderate short-lived response and can result in brief increases in heart rate or mild changes in the body stress or hormone levels. This type of stress is totally normal. It's part of a normal day of lives. Like for example, I always say is I experience normal stress before giving a presentation because I'm nervous. This stress is good because it kind of keeps me on my toes and it keeps me focused. So this happens to anyone. It could be from meeting new people, dealing with frustration. It's a normal part of life. So then in the middle, we have tolerable stress. What is tolerable stress? That is a stress response that has the potential to negatively affect the developing brain, but it generally occurs over limited time periods that allow the brain to recover and reverse potentially harmful effects. So the human brain actually does very well with tolerable stress. As long as the brain has periods of time when they're able to recover. And when it comes to children, as long as that child has a supportive caregiver, tolerable stress can actually be good because it can teach people and children how to overcome adversity. So a good example of this is maybe you have a child whose parents are getting divorced. That can be very stressful, but if that child has the support of both of their parents, that is a situation where they may be able to overcome it. And then so in the red bubble, we see toxic stress. So toxic stress is the result when there's prolonged stress management issues within that person, and they're experiencing kind of prolonged toxic stress. That can lead to adverse impacts, and that toxic stress is what will negatively impact a developing brain. So I have a little video here. I think it kind of sums up everything. I like to show it because it's more of a visual, but this video is about how stress can affect the brain.
Are you sleeping restlessly, feeling irritable or moody, forgetting little things, and feeling overwhelmed and isolated? Don't worry, we've all been there. You're probably just stressed out. Stress isn't always a bad thing. It can be handy for a burst of extra energy and focus, like when you're playing a competitive sport or have to speak in public. But when it's continuous, the kind most of us face day in and day out, it actually begins to change your brain. Chronic stress, like being overworked or having arguments at home, can affect brain size, its structure, and how it functions, right down to the level of your genes. Stress begins with something called the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, a series of interactions between endocrine glands in the brain and on the kidney, which controls your body's reaction to stress. When your brain detects a stressful situation, your HPA axis is instantly activated and releases a hormone called cortisol, which primes your body for instant action. But high levels of cortisol over long periods of time wreak havoc on your brain. For example, chronic stress increases the activity level and number of neural connections in the amygdala, your brain's fear center. And as levels of cortisol rise, electric signals in your hippocampus, the part of the brain associated with learning, memories, and stress control, deteriorate. The hippocampus also inhibits the activity of the HPA axis, so when it weakens, so does your ability to control your stress. That's not all though. Cortisol can literally cause your brain to shrink in size. Too much of it results in the loss of synaptic connections between neurons and the shrinking of your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that regulates behaviors like concentration, decision-making, judgment, and social interaction. It also leads to fewer new brain cells being made in the hippocampus. This means chronic stress might make it harder for you to learn and remember things, and also set the stage for more serious mental problems like depression and eventually Alzheimer's disease. The effects of stress may filter right down to your brain's DNA. An experiment showed that the amount of nurturing a mother rat provides its newborn baby plays a part in determining how that baby responds to stress later in life. The pups of nurturing moms turned out less sensitive to stress because their brains developed more cortisol receptors, which stick to cortisol and dampen the stress response. The pups of negligent moms had the opposite outcome, and so became more sensitive to stress throughout life. These are considered epigenetic changes, meaning that they affect which genes are expressed without directly changing the genetic code. And these changes can be reversed if the moms are swapped. But there's a surprising result. The epigenetic changes caused by one single mother rat were passed down to many generations of rats after her. In other words, the results of these actions were inheritable. It's not all bad news, though. There are many ways to reverse what cortisol does to your stressed brain. The most powerful weapons are exercise and meditation, which involves breathing deeply and being aware and focused on your surroundings. Both of these activities decrease your stress and increase the size of the hippocampus, thereby improving your memory. So don't feel defeated by the pressures of daily life. Get in control of your stress before it takes control of you.
Challenge.
Okay, so what I like to take away from that video is that even though stress can impact your brain, there are ways that we can foster those synaptic connections, and caregivers can have a huge impact on that when it comes to trauma and the development of a child's brain. So we're going to get into trauma and development. So the picture you see on your screen, that is the growth of the neurons within a child from when they are born to 2 years. So on the left-hand side, you can see there's a few there's a few synapses, but as you go just to the right, you can see how many more synapses that brain develops just between 2 years. So it's really amazing what's happening in a child's brain. So that's why it's important for us to understand how trauma can impact that development. So we know that trauma and that toxic stress, it can change the development of the brain. And why? It's because of those hormones. The cortisol and adrenaline keeps blood pressure, glucose levels elevated, and that can set off inflammatory responses. This can lead to changes like impaired immunity, risks of anxiety, autoimmune diseases, allergies, and asthma. So the issue when we're talking about trauma in a child's development is it's those neural connections in the prefrontal cortex, making it difficult for children to cope with stress. It can strengthen that survival response, the activation of the fight or flight mode, and then it can also make it really hard for kids to emotionally regulate. So the impact of trauma. So for our little ones, 0 to 2, this is how trauma can impact them. They can have a sensory impact on kids. So for the young ones, loud noises, frightening images, violent movements, all of these occurrences, this shatters a child's sense of safety. Children this age might, they might have nightmares. They might believe that all of their scary thoughts and their fears are going to happen. They are less able to anticipate danger and protect themselves. And at this stage, their brain is particularly vulnerable because it can reduce the size of that cortex. So within that prefrontal cortex is the memory, attention, perception, thinking, and may affect their IQ. So young children at this age, they fully depend on caregivers for survival. And this can also impact the type of attachment that they form with their caregivers, which will impact their future relationships. So these children might have poor verbal skills. They may exhibit memory problems, scream or cry excessively, and have poor appetite. So for children ages 3 to 6, they might have difficulties in focusing and learning in school. They may develop learning disabilities, have poor skill development, act out, They might imitate the abuse or the traumatic event. They may be verbally abusive themselves, be unable to trust others, blame themselves, lack self-confidence, and have somatic complaints. So that is when they might have tummy aches or feel tightness in their chest or have headaches. That's how trauma can manifest that way. So our school-aged kids from 7 to 12, these kids might have anxiety and worry about the safeties of others, or if the traumatic event will happen again. You may start to see real changes in their behavior. So decreased attention or concentration, increased activity levels, changes in their academic performance. They might have angry outbursts, or they might withdraw. They might have increased somatic complaints, so chest pain, stomach aches, headaches. They might not be comfortable talking about feelings, or they might want to discuss the event with you a lot. You might find them either over or under reacting to sensory stimuli. So they might be scared of loud noises, movements, things like that. They might have increased hyperarousal, so that fight or flight response. They may avoid things. They may avoid people, places, or things that remind them of the trauma, or they might become emotionally numb. And that's when they just become detached from their emotions. So for our teens, ages 13 to 18 and up, so social isolation is a big problem. They can have difficulty relating to others. They might be underachieving in school. They might have reoccurring thoughts of death, dying, or suicide ideations. This is really important to be mindful of when we're talking about teens. They might have somatic complaints. They might go to the doctor and the doctor might find nothing wrong with them. They might have poor impulse control, problems with aggression, self-destructive behaviors, sleep disturbances, distorted body images, and low self-esteem. That's a big one. They might have a heightened difficulty with authority, so maybe they're getting in trouble at school, and increased risk of substance use. So we want to be really mindful of that and be vigilant to recognize these at-risk behaviors within our teens. So even though trauma can have a really negative impact on children and their development, there is really good news, because there has been a lot of studies on trauma over the past few decades. And what these studies have found is that a big way to mitigate the negative impacts of trauma is fostering resilience. And also, if a child has the support of a positive, caring, protective, and stable caregiver. These are factors against the adverse effects of trauma. So, overcoming trauma, hope, and fostering resilience. What is resilience? So resilience is the ability to move on or carry on regardless of what trauma, breakdown, or failures face. It's really the ability to bounce back. And resilience is amazing because it's not a personality trait, but it's something it can be nurtured and polished. So resilience is a skill. So why is resilience so important? Well, because trauma doesn't affect all children the same. And there has been studies that examine different children who have experienced similar trauma. And some kids seem to really bounce back from it. Some kids don't seem to be affected as negatively as other children. And so what they have found is that it's the resiliency, that is the essential protective factor that provides children with the competencies, so the skills that can mitigate the long-term effects of trauma. So some of the research has revealed that resilient kids show improved learning and greater academic achievement. They generally miss school less. They demonstrate reduced risk-taking behaviors and are less likely to engage in excessive drinking, drugs, smoking. They have a lower mortality rate and better health. So these are just some factors of resilient kids that they have found. So this is a short video that I like to show. I feel like it explains resilience in a nutshell.
right. I want you to do everything that you can to knock your toy down. Who is the strongest in class? Jeron, come on up, please. I'm going to give Jeron a prop, and he's going to try to knock it off the table. Ready, Jeron? Okay, children, who can tell me what it means to have resilience? Yes, Paige?
Resilience means if you make the toy fall down, it'll come back up very, very fast.
Very nice.
I like that video because I think it kind of shows the essence of resiliency. So what is resiliency? It's teaching kids that even though they may experience challenges or adversity, but they can recover from that and they can kind of bounce back. So Kenneth Ginsburg, he's a pediatrician at the Philadelphia Children's Hospital. He proposed these 7 C's of resiliency in kids. So we have competence, confidence, connection, character, contribution, and coping. So how do we foster these 7 C's within our children? So for competence, so children will seek recognition when they do well, and they look for new opportunities to find things that they're good at and skills that they can use. So as caregivers, we can provide our children with opportunities where they feel successful, and so that they can build skills and kind of discover their new talents. So parents or caregivers are encouraged to focus on a child's strengths and not their weaknesses. Try to reframe mistakes in a positive manner. So trying to help them to understand how they could do things differently so they experience a more positive outcome the next time, even if they made a mistake. So empower kids to make their own decisions and think about solutions to things. Keep kids safe and be protected, but don't inundate them with worries or concerns. And also avoid comparing kids to their siblings or other children. So then we have confidence. And so as caregivers, it's really important to boost our children's confidence so they have faith in their own skills and they know that they can accomplish their goals. So what is the best part of your child's personality? Can you reflect that to them, and do they know that? What makes them unique and special? What are the strengths they have that can help them succeed? We want to teach our children about fairness and perseverance and how to be kind, and avoid pushing them to do things that they don't want to do. And also when we talk about praise, which we'll talk about later, let it be honest and genuine, even if your child has accomplished something many times. Connection. So kids like to feel, and people in general, because we're social beings, like we belong, so that we have meaningful connections with people and that other people care about us. So as caregivers, avoid pushing kids away if they have a problem, but help them build connections. So ensure the kids are safe, allow them the freedom to express how they feel. Try not to ever tell a child to stop crying if they are upset, but help them to cope with their feelings instead. Help them to learn how to resolve their problems and conflicts, and make sure your home is an open place for discussion. Foster healthy relationships and promote positive messages about relationships. Character. So every child needs to know who they are and also the difference between what's right and wrong. So as caregivers, you can help your child build character, and that will help them to kind of be able to overcome peer pressure, or even if they're put down in school. A character will help them do that. Show kids how to be empathetic and how their actions affect other people. Show kids how negative behaviors can have negative consequences, and encourage good choices and good decisions. And also share with kids the importance of helping others and eliminate stereotyping, prejudice, or any type of discrimination talk and beliefs. Contribution. So we found out that kids are really naturally empathetic and they like to help other people, and they often don't need to be prompted for that. So as caregivers, you can encourage your child's desire to help and also encourage your child to ask for help without shame. This is really important when it comes to mental health, especially for a child to know that it's okay to ask for help. It's okay if they are struggling. That's a very important point for them to learn. So it's helpful to have discussions on how your children can contribute to those around them, the community, or even talk about underprivileged people that may have less. Show kids what it's like to be compassionate. Show them the importance of helping other people. For caregivers as adults, model generosity and discipline with empathy as well, and create opportunities for them to help, such as chores. So coping is huge. Everyone needs coping skills. So children need effective coping skills to deal with distress. So that is something that we can teach our children, and we can teach children coping skills and also how to implement them so that they're better suited to overcome their challenges. So for you caregivers, it's always important as adults that we model our own positive coping skills, teach children how to appropriately cope with things when they feel negative emotions, and help children to implement them because sometimes they will need help. And it's helpful as adults to recognize the underlying stressors of their behavior, help them to identify it and help them find solutions. And then again, avoid telling children just to stop, help them understand their behavior and kind of choose more desirable good choices. And so lastly, we have control. Children who have a sense of control are more likely to bounce back after tragedy. So when kids feel like they're in control of their behavior, they're less likely to blame it on others. And they also learn how to be accountable, which makes it easier for them to kind of face their mistakes as they get older. So help children understand what is and isn't in their control. Okay, so now when it comes to trauma, kids that experience trauma may also exhibit problematic behaviors. So this could be disruptive, aggressive, or any type of behavior that may have existed before the trauma, and it may have worsened after. This is due to kind of the diminished ability to express how they feel in an appropriate way, going back to what we learned in the brain. So problematic behaviors may also be due to symptoms such as lack of sleep. So we want to be mindful of that. And then we also want to be mindful when it comes to discipline, how you feel as caregivers, depending on your role of the trauma that the child sustained. So caregivers may experience guilt about disciplining children sometimes. And the problem with that is that if you don't respond appropriately, it could actually reinforce the child's problematic behaviors. So we always want to link our child's behaviors to the trauma that they may have experienced. So we want to ask ourselves, why is this happening? Okay, so when it comes to shaping problematic behaviors, these are tools that we use in TFCBT that I work with parents to kind of shape their children's behavior in light of trauma. So these are, as caregivers, are probably going to sound very familiar. We have praise, we have active ignoring, timeout, and behavioral contingency charts. So praise, what is praise? So praise is very important that we praise desirable behavior. So when we praise our children, we want to try to be very specific. So instead of saying things like good job, say things, you did a really good job cleaning your room. Praise soon as possible after the desired behavior, and always be consistent and enthusiastic, and avoid negative qualifiers. So say a child cleans their room. Well, great job cleaning your room, but why didn't you do it earlier? Why didn't you do it the first time I asked? We want to use praise to increase desirable behavior. Timeout. So timeout is best to use with children under 11, and the purpose is to interrupt their behavior by providing a consequence, and that consequence is depriving that child of your attention. So timeout should occur in a quiet, understimulating room. It should only last a few minutes. And the child should understand what type of misbehavior resulted in this timeout. where they need to be for the timeout, and how long the timeout will last. So once the timer is started, caregivers should ignore any behavior that the child exhibits, except dangerous or unsafe behaviors. So we want to be mindful of what your child is doing to escape the timeout and make sure that it's not dangerous. Okay, active ignoring. So what's active ignoring? So that is when a caregiver try to ignore the defiant statements directed at caregivers. This could be when your child makes faces, eye rolling, smirking, taunting, or mimicking. We want to try to ignore that. You want to choose to react to non-dangerous behavior. I tell parents that when you first start using active ignoring, it's very common for the child's behavior to worsen because they will want to get your attention until you start to use it more frequently. So as caregivers, this includes avoiding verbal or emotional reactions, eye contact, and facial expressions towards the child. And then look to praise when your child accepts redirection. That's very important. So behavioral charts. So when we have children that have experienced trauma, and if they have problematic behaviors that we want to change, try to choose a few behaviors at a time. Discuss with them the type of rewards and how you're going to reflect that in the chart. So are they going to earn a star or a symbol or something for positive behaviors? Involve the child in the decisions about what the reward will be. For the younger ones, try to give daily rewards, and then for the older children, weekly rewards. And try to be consistent with the rewards as well. So when it comes to disciplining children, we want to take in consideration their development. So for early childhood, keep these behavior management strategies simple and straightforward. Focus on a few behaviors at a time. It's always good to remember that for the young children, it's difficult for them to remember multi-step directions. So for the example, put your toys away, put your pajamas on, and brush your teeth. It can be hard for them to remember several directions at one time. So try only issuing one direction. And that gives you a really good opportunity to praise them when they do that, when they accomplish that task. So for our middle childhood, for these children, they can play a more active role in defining their behavior management strategies. Give them a choice, talk to them about it, about what type of rewards they want, what they want their chart to look at. And at this stage, it's really good if you can coordinate with teachers or guidance counselors on the behaviors that they may be exhibiting. So there's some consistency with all the adults that your child has in their life. So for our teens, it's really good to work together with our teens, try to compromise, especially on responsibilities. Let them make their own choices and listen. So with teens, it's really helpful for caregivers to kind of have command of a basic of communication skills that's going to make your communication more effective with them. So try to use I statements, try to listen, summarize, paraphrase. These skills will make your conversations more effective with teens. Always try to validate how they feel. Affirm that you are listening and that you're concerned about them. Try to support them in their growing autonomy. They want to be independent. They want to make their own decisions, but it's important for you to still monitor them. And then again, I just stress with teens, be very vigilant with identifying high-risk behaviors. So we are talking about a substance abuse. We are talking about maybe dangerous activities, or monitoring for suicide ideations or any type of self-harm. Okay, so now we're going to get into emotional regulation. So if we go back to what we learned about in the brain, what's happening with the amygdala, the limbic system, and the prefrontal cortex, children that have been affected by trauma, and adults as well, they can find it very challenging to deal with emotional regulation. So what is emotional regulation? That's the ability to change and manage and respond to one's emotional state. What we know is the trauma and the chronic stress, it affects their ability to regulate emotions because of that response that's happening in the brain. So for adults and caregivers, it's very important that you're able to do this for yourself and that you're able to teach it to your children. This will help them manage strong emotions and behaviors. So this requires first your awareness of your thoughts, emotions, and physical sensations, the belief that you know that you can alter your emotional state and that you have the skills to do it. So this, as you can see, this is the zones of regulation, and this was proposed by LEAH and KUYPERS. So what you see before you are different zones. So we have the blue zone, and within the blue zone, you may be feeling sad, sick, tired, bored, or moving slowly. The green zone is known as the optimal zone. So that's when you're feeling calm, happy, feeling okay, focused, and ready to learn. The yellow zone, you may be feeling stressed, frustrated, worried, excited, or afraid. And then the red zone is when you might be mad or terrified, panicked, or enraged. So the thing to know about the zones of regulation is that every zone serves a purpose. What you have to do is you have to be mindful of the zone that you're in, and you have to ask yourself if the zone that you're currently in, is it suitable for the task at hand? So a good example that I like to use is, say that you just gotten into a fight with someone. Maybe it was a colleague at work, maybe it was a family member or your spouse, and then you find yourself behind a wheel of a car. You know, you have to drive somewhere. Say you're in the red zone because you're really mad. Now, would it be good for you to be driving in a red zone? Probably not. It would be more helpful if you were in the green zone. So as an adult, how do you get yourself from being in a state of red back to a green zone? So that might take just taking a few deep breaths before you start driving. That is what emotional regulation is. So this is a strategy plan. This is an adult example. So for adults, you first want to be able to identify what's triggering you to become emotionally dysregulated. What makes you upset? Being ignored, people yelling, not having control, learning what emotionally triggers you. That's very helpful. That's the first step. Identify the physical warning signs. So going back to what we learned about the brain, noticing how your body is reacting. Do you feel restless, agitated, shortness of breath, tightness in chest, sweating? All of those are signs to you indicating that you're experiencing and you're becoming dysregulated. And what are your coping skills? What are your calming strategies? How do you calm down? Calm your body and your mind will follow. Do you need to take some deep breaths, go away, go for a walk, call a friend, listening to music? You have to be aware of all the things that you can do to calm yourself down. So for children, this is the characters from the movie Inside Out, the movie, to teach kids about emotions. So this is the zones of regulation using the characters of that movie. So this can be helpful to show kids to kind of help them understand their zones. So this is a regulation strategy plan. So this is a blank one, and I'm going to show you one filled out next. But when we talk about regulating children's emotions, we want to have a plan with them on how they can understand what they're feeling and how as caregivers can support them. So this is just an example, and I can send the blank documents for anyone who is interested in having them themselves. But you want to identify with kids what's upsetting them and how people can tell that they're upset. When they're having a hard time with their emotions, try to hear from them what they don't want you to do. Try to provide them ways with how they can calm down and what they can do when they are feeling dysregulated. So what can they do when they're upset? So this is just an example of a school-age child's completed plan. So they said that things that upset them are changing plans at the last minute, exaggerating or making things up, accusations. People can tell that they're upset when they have a mean face on. They might be yelling or stomping and swearing or breaking rules. And they worked with their caregiver to come up with, they don't want their caregiver to talk about it as soon as it happens. They need some time, giving him negatives and taking away privileges. They didn't like that. They want the caregiver to give them more space and time alone and distract them with something that they like to do. And then at the bottom, they listed several coping skills that they can use when they're upset. Okay, so lastly, we're going to talk about self-care for caregivers, because this is really important. Self-care is not a luxury. It's really necessary in order to make sure that you as caregivers are kind of functioning at your optimum level. And especially with everything that's been going on this past year with the pandemic, I'm sure many of us have been experiencing chronic stress. So it's really important to address your self-care, because it is important. Being stressed and overwhelmed, it can make it hard to be empathetic and patient. So self-care is really important. And even if you don't have time for a lot of self-care, small changes can make a huge difference. Making sure you're getting enough sleep, and making sure you're eating a healthy diet, engaging in activity or exercise. And I always encourage people to check in with themselves. Ask yourself, how are you feeling mentally and physically? What have you been thinking about the most? What was your last full meal? Have you been sleeping? Do you need to drink some water? What did you do today that was good for you? And what's something that can bring you joy? Just taking a few minutes to ask yourself these questions, that can help you kind of figure out if you need to engage in some type of self-care. So these are just some self-care ideas. There are so many ideas, but just remember, you can't pour from an empty cup. So is it meditation, mindfulness, deep breathing, positive self-talk, always making sure that if you find that you have a negative narrative in your head, that you're talking to yourself positively, talk to yourself like you're talking to a good friend, spending time in nature, listening to music, exercise, engaging in your senses, and then making sure that you're connected, which certainly has been challenging over this past year. And as caregivers, I know it's sometimes impossible to find times to be alone, but 5 minutes is good, even if you can just take 5 minutes to breathe. And then also personal development, listening to a podcast, reading a book. These are all good ideas for self-care. Okay, so I appreciate everyone hanging in there with me. I know it's been a long presentation with a lot of information, but I just wanted to show this last video. This is just a little breathing exercise. So I'm just going to play it, and I encourage everyone just to take a few breaths and to follow the breathe bubble, and just kind of just relax for a minute. So let me play this. Okay, that's it. Thank you, everyone. Now, everyone's questions are welcome. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. Okay.
Well, I tell you, there's a lot of information, Tierney. I don't see any questions yet in the chat. I'm gonna suggest that folks can drop questions in the chat. Tierney is also offered to stay if anybody has questions you'd like to ask once we stop recording. And she is going to also share her contact information. So she will be available for, sometimes there's a scenario that you'd kind of like to go through. And as Tierney says, she may not always have the answers, but I know she's really good at either digging some up or directing folks to resources. So that's really important to know. But Tierney, I do have one question that I'm going to throw out to you, is that a lot of what you talked about, I think this is correct, but I just want to confirm, a lot of what you talked about also applies to older, like young adults as well, right? With the trauma. I mean, it's not just something that's unique to children as far as the body's reaction to the different kinds of trauma.
Absolutely, adults as well. Because as you can see, that's why I think it's helpful to understand what's going on in the brain. because trauma is going to affect the brain, whether or not you're in utero or whether or not you're an adult. So it does have the effects on the brain, and it's going to affect people in the way they think and the way they feel and the way they behave.
That's great. Or if anybody has a question that they'd like to ask, you can also hop off mute. We're happy to, I think that they're able to do that, correct, Krista?
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead, Maureen.
All right.
Okay, so will we be able to get the PowerPoint presentation? Because there was a lot of information that was so good, but I don't know if I could remember it all.
Absolutely.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you so much, Tierney. We'll make sure that we get that out to you, Marina. I agree. And I totally, I have to say, Tierney, I love the videos that you shared, that resiliency. The Weebles Wobble, I think is really such a great symbolic demonstration, right, of what we really hope for in resiliency. And I want to underscore the fact that you said that resilience is a skill that children can learn.
Yeah, resiliency, that's a skill, and that's a skill that not only children can learn, but anyone can learn it. And it's great, and it will really help anyone overcome adversity, because life isn't easy. So we want to have that mindset where we can bounce back and we have the skills to do so. So that information that I provided on resiliency and how to foster that with children, that is taken from a book by Frank Dixon. It's a wonderful, wonderful book, and I would encourage all parents, caregivers to read it.
What's the book called, Tierney?
I will look at the title for you. I'll send it to you, but it's by Frank Dixon.
Okay, that's great. I know somebody just dropped in the chat asking what resources will be included. What we will do is we were going to share a copy of this presentation of the video. We will share the slide deck so that you can see the slides, and then also I know Tierney and I'll work together to get things like the book title and author and that kind of thing too. And Tierney, I do see a question regarding how can a child overcome their trauma?
Okay, so for children, as we learned about, trauma can impact them in very different ways. And I think it depends on kind of what symptoms that child is exhibiting. So I'd have to learn more about it, but certainly children can overcome their trauma. There's different type of therapies that are very specific to helping children overcome their trauma, like TFCBT. But there are all sorts of different therapies that are really just trauma informed that can help kids kind of process everything that they're going through. That's a big part of healing from trauma, is being able to process the traumatic events and then equipping them with the different skills and the competencies to cope with their trauma symptoms and to be aware of their trauma triggers and how they can, overcome them with their certain skills and coping mechanisms.
And I think what you're also saying, Tierney, is that every situation is different. Is it not? It seems to me that having somebody like yourself or someone who is really trauma informed helping you decide the best way forward with a child or young adult would be helpful.
Absolutely, because it affects everyone differently. We are so unique as humans. The way, whatever your trauma is, it could be affecting your behavior, it could be affecting everyone differently. So that's really important to keep in mind when you have a child that's been impacted by trauma.
Tierney, we have a great question from Victoria about the 7 C's, which I was really fascinated by the 7 C's. And the question is, the 7 C's to build resilience, are they applicable to teens and young adults? Or how would you translate those concepts to an older group of people?
Yes, so I love resilience because anybody can learn how to be resilient at any age. So the information that I provide in that presentation, that was aimed towards the younger children, but it could definitely be aimed towards adolescents. And those concepts can be applied to older people as well. But there is so much information on how adults can build resiliency. There is something called neuroplasticity. And what we know from neuroplasticity is that your brain, it can actually continue to make neural synaptic connections throughout your life. So even if you're an adult that has been affected negatively by trauma or really impacted negatively by anything in your life, your brain can still recover from it. It can still develop these synaptic connections and you can become resilient. So I would love to provide different resources for adults or teenagers that are really looking to be more resilient themselves, I can do that as well.
That would be wonderful, Tierney. Thank you so much. I'm seeing lots of great presentation. Thank you for the information. And we are at our 1 o'clock hour. So Tierney, I'm going to close us out, just asking folks to remember that, first of all, thank you for coming to join us today. Tierney, that was an excellent presentation. I'm reminding you that we're here next week at Lunch and Learn. And next week, we're doing something a little bit different. We're actually bringing in a very successful business owner. Donna Miller owns C3 Consulting Group, and she is going to talk to us next week about what we can learn from running a business and apply it to our own lives. Because even if you don't run your own business, she wants us to know that, you know what, we are our business, right? We need to make sure that we are she wants to debunk the myth of balance, life-work balance. And she wants to talk about how, especially in this time of remote working and virtual learning and all these different things going on, about how important it is for us to approach taking care of ourselves, which Tierney talked about today, and balancing things in our lives, kind of from a business perspective, like maybe having a business plan for yourself. How are you going to take care of yourself? How's that going to affect other things in your life? So that's next week for our Lunch and Learn. And I want to thank you for coming out, and remember that Family Partners, we're here for you, for connecting you to resources and meaningful information. And I'm going to stop the recording, but if anybody would like to stay on the call and have a word with Tierney, I would invite you to do so. So Tierney Valley, thank you so much for coming out and putting together such not only an informative, but really an engaging presentation. It was wonderful having you with us today. So Tierney Valley's from Center for Evaluation and Counseling. I will say it correctly this time. So thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, I'm turning off. Thanks, everybody.
All right, good.